Okay, we're now recording. Welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be teaching through Anshe Chesed again and getting us ready for Pesach with some thoughts about elements of the Passover Seder. And the thing that I really want to emphasize, the thing that I want to really draw our attention to, is this tension between inclusion and exclusion, both as a theme in the Passover Seder and as a broader theme in Judaism. The way I want to think about this issue is that any meaningful community, any community of meaning, whether it be a religious community, a political community, or some kind of society that has ethical norms and values, in order to live by those norms and values, it has to find ways to designate the people who violate those norms and values. And by doing that, inevitably, you are in a position as a community of having to engage in acts of exclusion. Now, you might immediately say, well, but if it's one thing to enforce norms or to insist on norms or standards or values for a community. It's another thing to completely exclude people, right? We might punish people, we might rebuke people for violation of certain dearly held values or communal norms. But that doesn't mean that we're excluding them from the community. And that's certainly true in a formal sense. We usually don't do that. But at the same time, in the process of having to designate the values that we cherish, we do have to we do inevitably, I think, make distinctions between those who uphold the values of the community and those who don't. And as much as we try to be positive about focusing on people who uphold our values rather than focusing too much attention on people who fail to uphold those values, we nonetheless get into this position of having to deal with some kind of exclusion or finding ourselves putting people who don't uphold the values of the community in some state of alienation. And that creates all sorts of problems, right? Because it risks shunning people, it risks excluding people from the community in such a complete way that we end up leaving people out. And do we then not diminish our community, right? This is the risk, is that do we not diminish our community even as we attempt to enhance the strength of our community by insisting on those values and norms that we hold dear, right? So I think what I want to see today in texts of the Passover Haggadah, but also in the other passages from the Talmud and from other sources of rabbinic literature, is that the rabbis were very sensitive to this issue of the tension between inclusion and exclusion. That when you uphold communal norms and values, you're placing yourself in a position of having to exclude people. And then how do you deal with that when what you want to create is an inclusive community? So while the particular values that the rabbis put forth might not be exactly the same as ours all the time, and while their methods of dealing with this issue in terms of like, well, how do you deal with people who don't uphold the norms of the community, or what do you say about them, right? How do you label them even, right? How do you talk about people who are upholding or who are failing to uphold the values of the community? While we might choose different language for that, right? Recognizing how powerful language is as a tool of either inclusion or exclusion, right? Nonetheless, I want to help us think about the way in which that topic is central to what's going on in the Passover Seder and central to Judaism itself. And I have a sort of secondary agenda, which gets into an issue that I love, which is figuring out sort of how the Seder works, kind of on a more technical level. But one of the things I hope to come up with in all of this is some sort of explanation as to why the number 4 has such an important role as a theme in the Passover Seder, right? So you have 4 cups of wine, and then you have something like the 4 questions, and then you have this text of the 4 children, which is a very sort of well-known text, and it's such a source of of thoughtful reflection in terms of the meaning of the Seder, that I have sort of an idea about why the number 4 is so central. And in the course of discussing this issue in the text we'll look at, I'll present sort of what I think that theme is doing so prominently in the Seder. Why is the number 4, right? And of course, it goes without saying, right, there are all these other numbers in Judaism that are really important, right? There's the number 3, there's the number 7, right, associated with Shabbat, the number 12, the number 40 comes up a lot in the Bible, right? The number 4 doesn't appear as prominently in the Bible. And I think it's something that the rabbis focus on for a value that they hold dear, and it's related to this issue of inclusion and exclusion. And it has a very important role in shaping their idea about what the Seder is about. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a part of this section of the 4 children, and we're going to then look at a couple of additional passages from Pirkei Avot from the Talmud that use the number 4 in a similar way to this section about the four children. And then we'll look at an additional midrash that's actually about Sukkot, because Pesach doesn't stand alone as a holiday. It kind of is part of the cycle of holidays that culminates in Sukkot. So I think looking at the text about Sukkot, about the Lulav, actually will give us some greater insight into how the rabbis as a whole are dealing with these questions of exclusion and inclusion. You're welcome to unmute yourself. We don't have so many people in the room that I'm concerned about. Like, obviously, if you're going to have background noise, try to avoid it. But at this point, are there any questions or thoughts? Because I have the screen shared, I may not be able to see you. So you're welcome to just unmute yourself and chime in if you have any questions or thoughts at this point. All right, so let's start with, and I'm gonna ask you questions, particularly about the second text, which is the passage about the Rasha, the evil or the wicked child at the Seder. And but by the way, in translating this, I kept these titles, the 4 sons here, but otherwise, I largely tried to shift the language to inclusive language, especially gender inclusive language. So there may be uses of the word there, T-H-E-I-R, where it should be, you'd think there'd be a singular, but I'm using it in a kind of sort of non-gendered, as a non-gendered pronoun. And if anyone has questions about how language develops in this regard, I'd be happy to discuss that on the side at some other point. But that's the intent there, is to avoid gender-specific language in a lot of this, where a lot of the original translations use he to kind of be a generic person, or just an assumption that the subject here is boys with the sons, with the 4 sons. So I've changed the language and changed translations in a number of places to reflect the desire for gender inclusivity. So first there's the passage of the 4 sons. So let's start with that, and then we'll talk about the Rasha specifically, right? Blessed be the place of all. This is the name Makom for God that's used here. Blessed be the place of all. Blessed be God. Blessed be the one who gave Torah to God's people Israel. Blessed be God. Corresponding to 4 children did the Torah speak: one who is wise, one who is evil, one who is innocent, and one who doesn't know to ask. Right. So we're used to this this structure here from the Seder itself, that there are these 4 children. And what the text goes on to do is it mentions each child and provides a verse from the Torah where there is as kind of evidence for this kind of child, right? Basically what the rabbis are doing is they're taking the various passages in the Torah that speak about the Passover Seder, where you shall tell your children, or it says your child shall ask, and it provides the various answers. So essentially this passage about the 4 children is a midrash. It is a creative interpretation where the rabbis are saying, look at these different passages in the Torah and notice that they're referring to 4 different types of children, and really what it comes down to is 4 different types of learners. So that the Torah is saying, look, they're going to be different types of people at your Seder, right? This is the message, that's sort of the upshot, the practical upshot for us who run a Seder is, and this is why it takes place towards the beginning of the Seder, is to say that there are going to be different types of people at your Seder, and you have to prepare the Seder in order to include everybody, right? To be mindful of the different types of people who are at your Seder, but of course it's not just at your Seder, right? And I think, the real object of the Seder is our children. And so the rabbis are saying, well, there are different types of children out there, right? And so the way you teach the Exodus from Egypt as part of the Seder is going to depend on what kind of child you have. So there are different things you have to do depending on what kind of child you have in front of you, right? And I would say not just for children, but for anyone who comes to a Seder, right? Anyone who comes to a Seder is going to come with a different approach, a different mindset, a different background, right? The wise child comes already kind of knowing a lot and is kind of ready to go into greater depth and learn more, right? So right, the wise child, you'll remember, right, asks this very long question, right? What are the commandments and the statutes and all these types of things, right? And the idea is that the wise child knows, or it's really like the learned child, right? The learned child already knows the terminology. So they're already into the learning. They already know what they're supposed to ask in a way, right? And so you should give them something more in depth. The child who doesn't know how to ask, right, is someone who doesn't even know what to say. And the simple child asks a very simple question, right? What is all of this about, right? Then there's the wicked child. The wicked child comes second. So let's read this passage and focus on that and see what it says, right? So what does the wicked child or the evil child say? What is this worship to you and not to them? And since they exclude themselves from the collective, they deny a principle of the Jewish faith. And accordingly, you will blunt their teeth and say to them, for the sake of this, did the Lord do this for me in going out of Egypt? For me and not for them. If they had been there, they would not have been saved. So one question I can ask, and I want to open it up here, but one question I want to ask is this a text of inclusion or is this a text of exclusion? Because on the one hand, the directive given in this text is, here is how you deal with this child, right? We're not writing this child out of the text. We're not writing this child out of the experience. But at the same time, there's this very harsh language about this child. And I would say, well, so I want to leave it to you to sort of puzzle over this, right? What is being said here about this child vis-a-vis the question of inclusion or inclusion versus exclusion, right? Who, according to this text, is doing the including or the excluding, right? Someone's welcome to just chime in.
Well, Bill, literally, it seems to say that God would have excluded the person with that attitude from being taken out of slavery.
God.
Yeah, well, it says, if they had been there, they would not have been saved. The Jews were saved, the Israelites were saved by God, taken out of slavery, and the implication is that you would have been left behind.
Right. Okay.
This is super pertinent to my family because my family's all atheists, and we always have a Seder, but everyone rolls their eyes except for me, of course. I take it really seriously. The God language is hard for them, and any gender language, which it's great to make inclusive language, but sometimes it's awkward, so that doesn't always happen. And there's always a fight, and there's always bad feelings around the holidays, and it involves like me wanting something and then other people having other needs. And what you're saying really chastens me, because maybe I haven't been inclusive enough, right? Maybe I have, as the so-called wise child, I think I know it all, or I think I know something more. And, I would say, like, my sister, although she rolls her eyes and makes it difficult and doesn't know how to plan in a way that I feel you need to plan for a religious ceremony, she wants to be there. And, you know, my nephew, who maybe doesn't even always want to be there, he feels Jewish, you know, he relates to this too. And so I'm like, it gets very personal here. And what you've said is going to, I hope, inform me in the future.
Great. I mean, Margot, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, have you ever wanted to blunt their teeth?
Oh yeah. I mean, you know, you yell at them, and then, I mean, last year it was going to be a Zoom Seder and Leo couldn't plan. And then I said, well, to hell with it. We're going to cancel it. And, you know, Eve said, hey, I really wanted it to happen and you canceled it. Right. So that was horrible of me. Really a bad choice. I blunted their teeth.
Yeah.
I made some assumptions about what their so-called evil attitude said. And it didn't mean that. It didn't mean I don't want to be there. I don't want to be part of this. I fully reject it. It just meant, hey, this is how I relate to it.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think what you're telling, I mean, I'm really glad that you're sharing this personal story, because I think that this gets at the tension precisely, right? That and it provides a kind of modern example of what this tension looks like, which is this is a harsh text, right? But I don't think that the harshness is a simplistic kind of exclusion either, right? That is, it is and we'll talk about this in a moment, right? That there is this recognition of exclusion, right? That if they had been there, they would not have been redeemed. And I want to talk a little bit more about that and explore that a little bit more. But so the possibility of exclusion is placed here in front of us, that here is the one who is putatively excluded, potentially excluded. But by having them in the text and by saying that there's a reaction that we have to them, there's also a movement of inclusion. Now, again, I'm not saying, right, like I'm not supporting corporal punishment, right? So this is the place where I say, like, well, look, that's not necessarily my method, right? But I also want to say that, like, engaging people even in a kind of hostile, or I would say hostile, but like in a mode of rebuke, right? I mean, whatever blunting their teeth is supposed to be, it's clearly meant as rebuke, and rebuke is a form of education, right? It's meant that way. And this is an educational text fundamentally, right? The For Children is fundamentally an educational text. It's about how you educate people and bring them into Torah, right? So again, the issue is right here, like, not like, well, is corporal punishment okay? I think the answer is clearly no. But what I would say is that, right, when you are in education and when you're trying to build community together, you have to face the possibility of those who will not uphold the norms of the community, right? So in the case of your sister, right, is that like, you're here, but you're not with me, right? It's that you're in, but you're not really with us. And that's the tension that's brought up with the evil child.
It's painful for everyone. It's not, you know, the rebuke in my family's case is painful for everyone. And I'm sure for anyone who has to blunt the teeth of their child, it's painful. Can't be happy.
Yeah.
And losing members of a community is really painful also.
Right. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in here at this point?
You know, there are lots of stories in the Torah that seem very, very harsh, and one way which we explain them, or it could have been the actual logic behind it, is that they're really stories. They're warnings. They're not like reality. And I was thinking about this as we read this. You know, the reality is that Margot's family is there. They're not the wicked one, right? They weren't excluded, right? This is kind of a warning, which is you know, to make you feel that you're there. It doesn't say, yeah, we blunt their teeth, but we don't exclude them, because the person who was excluded, their ancestors aren't here.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I think part of what's fascinating here is that the evil child is blamed for excluding themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that presents a challenge, right? If we look at this with a critical eye, we might say to ourselves, well, why is this person excluding themselves, right? I mean, this is kind of not the straightforward meaning of this text, but we might ask ourselves, well, what did they go through that they're putting themselves at a distance from the community, right? Because I think this is not something that the rabbis necessarily thought of in their mindset, but I think we see this a lot today in the Jewish world, is that people do have negative experiences in Jewish community, and they may look like outsiders or defiant ones or against the community. And we might say, well, what did they go through? That's not always the case, right? Sometimes people are just, difficult about things, and we would ask more connection and more loyalty from people to the community. But sometimes, loyalty has to be earned, and the community hasn't done enough to earn that. And I think we can all think of examples of, sort of ranges of seriousness of those kinds of examples. But I think it is interesting that the text, in a way, tries to tries to shift the blame of exclusiveness or exclusion, I should say, right? Exclusion onto the person themselves who has taken themselves out, right? The voice, right? That this very close reading of the Torah's language from Exodus is lachem, right? It's, what is this worship to you? And it's plural, you. It's clearly plural in the Hebrew, right? So it's you all, right? Right? It's what are you all doing, right? I'm sitting here on the outside, and I'm looking at all of you. What is this that you are all doing, right? And because they exclude themselves, right, they are denying their participation, right? They're really denying the fact that they're part of the community. But what's interesting is that if it is a principle of Judaism, right, it doesn't really clarify what the principle of Judaism is that that's being violated. But presumably it has something to do with the fact that all of Israel is responsible for one another, right? This is a famous Talmudic statement that all of Israel, all Jews are responsible for one another. If that's the case, then, though, right, again, is this a text of exclusion or inclusion, right? Because what we're saying is we're calling this person, this evil child, to account for their failure to be a part of the community. So at least we're dealing with them, right? We haven't written them out of our story in a way. Any other thoughts at this point? I want to mention a few other things about this text, but
Bill,
yeah.
If I could just one more comment, and that is that, speaking on behalf of all semi-assimilated Jews in America, I always, this particular reference to the evil son was always made me and other people in the family uncomfortable. And Seders were often times where you had, people who were not particularly religious, and of course, non-Jews participating very often in our Seders. And it was just like, what is it? Why are we talking about an evil son, in this sort of happy occasion? And I'm glad you're talking about it today, because it's always been, sometimes we just skip it.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is a great point, because I think what this text looks like to us in modern American Judaism is really different than what the rabbis were thinking. And I would say that it's important to appreciate the extent to which, the rabbis are living in a world of traditional societies where there was assumptions that, children would maintain the sort of family customs or religion of their parents and their ancestors, right? Even if it wasn't a tribal structure, right? There was a very, very strong sense of family connection. And that's not to say that parents and children didn't fight. I'm sure certainly they did. And there may have been, in fact, deep quarrels and various times of like family conflict that took place in the pre-modern period. But what's important here is that I think the important difference is that once you enter the modern world, you really begin to have an entire societal structure that allows for the sort of easy severing of ties between members of families, but also just disconnection from religion and or tradition. I mean, by the way, I mean, even the idea that religion is something that kind of exists separate from family structure or separate from ethnic or cultural identity, right? All of that is really new to the modern world, right? And the idea, it's not so much, and one of the things that's very important is we not romanticize pre-modern Judaism. It's not so much that Jews were so well educated all the time. Some were, some weren't, right? And education was something that belonged to the elite very often. But at the same time, most Jews understood themselves as being part of Judaism, being part of the Jewish people in some way. And that was not something that was a contingent factor for them. Whereas in modern Western societies, Jews can kind of move back and forth and have very robust participation in non-Jewish society in the modern West. And obviously, there's a whole story about anti-Semitism in the modern West also, which sort of cuts against this in certain ways. But the idea, at least, is that Jews can have this very robust participation in non-Jewish society without really, in a way that may pull away from that, right? Pull away from a sense of Jewish connection. But I think that's all. What's interesting is that your reaction, Ken, is I think is rooted in the sense of, well, who is this about, right? In other words, that the sense of like disconnectedness from the tradition already creates an anxiety about who is the excluded person. Is that me? That it's like, are you talking about? Wait, am I the one you're talking about? Right? Is that? Oh, you mean me? Right? I'm the excluded one, right? So this issue comes up kind of in a very visceral way, precisely for the Jews who are sort of less conversant in the tradition, right? And I think that's why this is an important text to unpack in a certain way, right? And the way that resonates, right? The ones who exclude themselves, right? And I want to put out, just because you said something before, Ken, about that God would have left them out. It's interesting that it doesn't actually say that. It doesn't actually say God would have left them out. And I wonder whether there's the possibility within this text to say that maybe what the text is saying is, well, if they left themselves out, they just wouldn't have left, right? They would have said, okay, well, that's nice for you. Or it wouldn't have been, or perhaps it doesn't come about so much as a divine punishment, so much as just a kind of a reality of social life, right? That there are Jews who are just not participating, right? People who are leaving themselves out of this, right? Well, if they leave themselves out, right? And this is kind of a rough text, right? Again, and I'm going to come back to this point at the end, right? That this is a rough text, and the text in some ways is saying, well, you've left yourself out, you're out, right? And yet again, there's this move to rebuke, right? To blunt their teeth and say to them, right? What is the impact? And this is the other thing we can discuss is, right? What does it mean when they say for me, right? Well, for me, you say, well, maybe for me is a way of saying like me and not you, right? Which is exactly what the text interprets it that way, right? At the same time, it could be a move of authenticity, right? In other words, it's saying like, look, this is who I am. This is what matters to me. All you can do in speaking to such a person who excludes themselves is to speak from personal authenticity. And if they're not moved by it, there's nothing more you can do, right? So I don't think we have to look at this text as giving kind of like one simple answer to one simple problem, right? There are lots of different types of problems that can kind of be connected to the wisdom of this text, but also different kinds of answers or different types of possibilities. And it's not a guarantee of, right, it's not a guarantee that anything's going to work, right? And there's, as a pedagogical text, sometimes we want a pedagogical text to give us like a kind of an answer that's always going to work, right? Like a solution or a technique, an educational technique that's always going to work, right? I think teachers far more experienced than me will tell you, right, that that's not actually what's happening in education, right? In education, you as the teacher have to kind of come with an authenticity and integrity into what you're doing and to present what it is that you're trying to do in the best way possible with all that authenticity and integrity. You don't know what you're going to result, right? In fact, the best education has to take into account that the student, the disciple, the child has a choice about how to respond to your call, right? There are no guarantees. In fact, if you thought that there was some sort of technique that would guarantee it, you might be educating in the wrong sort of way. Right? I want to move on to the next set of texts, but if there are any other comments or questions about this, I want to give people that opportunity. Okay, and feel free to raise your hand. I'll scroll through the list of participants and
Bill,
your hand raised. Yeah, Eileen. Yeah,
I just
Eileen.
wanted to add, over the years, we've always had a very full house for Passover, Jewish families and non-Jewish families, and children who brought home friends, etc. And we kind of wound up making our own Haggadah from different pieces, from different ones that we thought fit the situation better. And we took out this part many, many years ago because we thought, I've always been offended by the thought of an evil child and not even going to the child abuse of the teeth, but that whole idea, and we just wound up taking it out. Don't judge me, Bill.
No. On the contrary, no. I think that's like I think that's I think that's a, in a way, right? Like that's a response to the problem of the text itself, right? Like if I only just want, if at the risk of being a little pedantic, right? It's like, yeah, exactly, right? Like you're thinking about who's at your Seder. That's the point of this text, is to think about who's at your Seder, right? So in a way, right, the text, you've sort of pointed to like the text being its own undoing, right? That we just can't, look, this is also sort of a broad dilemma with Jewish liturgy, right? Where we recognize that a lot of Jewish liturgy comes from a time of place and a worldview that's different, very different than ours. And at what point do we say, look, this liturgy, this piece of text just doesn't work for us anymore. We need to change it. We need to take it out, right? And so different Jewish communities have kind of struggled with that question in different ways. The great thing about Seder, I think, is that we don't have to worry about like the synagogue ritual committee. We get to do it ourselves, right? As you say, and the great proliferation of Haggadot makes it possible to kind of learn and play with things and do things differently every year. And you can have 5 Haggadot at the same Seder if you want. I mean, I don't know how you run a Seder like that, but it's certainly possible to have different approaches. And I think that's it's wonderful that you've sort of made that decision. So I want to, so let's move on to the next text, because then I think it gets into this question of like, well, how does this text, because this is in some ways more violent, right? The texts we're going to look at now are less violent. They're less, and in some ways they're less exclusionary. They're less biting in their exclusion. And I want to, but yet they still designate somebody as the no-goodnik, right? And sometimes they use the word rasha, which means evil or wicked, right, as well. And we'll see how that's used. But I think it maybe helps us put it into a different kind of context, but also gets at this issue of the number 4. Why is the number 4 so prominent in the Passover Seder? So this is a series of texts from Pirkei Avot. There's actually a few more that I didn't have here, that I didn't include here, but I brought a couple of the most prominent ones. And so if you look at Pirkei Avot chapter 5 in this section, you'll see a few more. And it runs through a number of different kinds of texts that are all about either 4 different types of students or 4 different types of people, right? So this is chapter 5, number 12 in Pirkei Avot, which is from the Mishnah. So this is a text that was probably redacted around the year 200. So the material comes from the year 200 and probably about 100, 150 years prior to that. There are 4 temperaments among students, right? Easy to provoke and easy to appease. Okay, I should let me introduce it, right? This is talking about different types of students based on their sort of their character, right? And with respect, especially with respect to anger, which I think is very interesting. The rabbis were very interested in the way in which sort of one's temperament around anger or impulsivity could affect one's learning, which in some ways is a very basic point, but I think we sort of overlook. I mean, I'm sure very seasoned teachers don't overlook this. They're probably very aware of this, but something that we may not think about all the time in education, right? So there are 4 temperaments among students, right? One is easy to provoke and easy to appease. Their gloss is canceled by their gain. Okay, so in other words, someone who easily gets provoked, they move very quickly into anger and impulsivity, but then they'll calm down or be appeased very easily. So they may lose something out by being easily provoked, but then they gain something. So there's kind of a neutrality there, right? Hard to provoke, hard to appease. Their gain is canceled by their loss, right? So if someone is, they don't anger easily, but then when they do, it's hard to appease them. So usually they're in good shape, but then once they get into a state perhaps of anger or something like that, or just high emotional intensity, they lose what they would have gained by virtue of the fact that it was hard to provoke them in the first place, right? And you can imagine here, there's a kind of rudimentary rabbinic psychology going on here, right? These rabbis are teachers of disciples. They're aware of human character. So they've come up with this kind of psychological profiles, if you will, of different types of students, right? And then they say, hard to provoke, easy to appease. Okay, well, that's your ideal student, right? They don't get very angry very easily, but if they do, it's very easy to kind of get them to calm down. They are pious, right? The word there is, actually the word there is chacham. I sort of changed that in the translation. I don't love, because it's not really pious. It's wise or learned, right? In other words, this is the student who's going to make the most of their learning, right? The word chacham can mean wise in the sense of like worldly wisdom, of having, making good decisions and whatnot. But I think in this case, it just means learned, right? A good student, right? We know students who they do the work, they read carefully, they gain the as much as realistically possible from the learning. And then you have the 4th category, right? Easy to provoke and hard to appease. So that's just somebody who is very difficult. They're your most difficult student. And here the word is wicked, though the word in Hebrew is not rasha, but ra, which means bad. It's a little bit less intense than rasha. I'm not sure, sometimes these words they're not so precise. So I'm not sure what more to explicate about that. But you see here that there's this categorization, and notice how it's based on a very simple structure where there are 2 factors, right? And then you have 2 possibilities for each factor, and so you end up with 4 total possibilities based on that structure, right? So it's a very easy text to memorize, and certainly these in their original context in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era, these texts would have been memorized. They would have been formulated orally and transmitted orally and memorized orally without a written text. The rabbis of the 1st and 2nd century, and for several hundred years later, were probably working in an entirely oral learning culture, right? So we have 2 more examples here, right? And this is also students, this one is a broader categorization, right? There are 4 types among those who frequently attend the house of study, the Beit Midrash, right? And here again, we have two factors. One is people who attend and people who practice, right? One attends but does not practice. They receive a reward for attendance, right? Good attendance, right? You know, okay. But practice here means actually practices the commandments or practices what they're learning, right? And in a practical way, right? One who practices but does not attend, they receive a reward for practice. Okay, so they get 1 out of 2, right? One who attends and practices, right? And here the word is chassid, which is pious. So here I like the translation pious. The word is chassid, right? Someone who is devoted, a very devoted religious person, right? Like the chassidim, right? One who neither attends nor practices, they are wicked. And here the word is rasha, actually, not ra, but rasha, like we have in the Passover text, right? What's something that you notice about either of the texts that we've looked at so far? Anything to comment on or questions about them?
One thing I noticed in the difference between pious and wise and wicked and bad is that in the first example, it really wasn't making a judgment on their character. It's basically, are they good students or not?
Right.
Whereas this one is kind of a little bit more judgmental.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think you're right that the first one is more psychological and pedagogical, and this one is more moralistic, right? It's giving you more of a broader communal framework for understanding the different types of Jews in the community in terms of their upholding the standards of the community. Whereas the first one is again, much more sort of psychological and pedagogical, right? You know, and I think lots of teachers always have that student that maybe there are days that they wish they weren't there. Maybe the best teachers kind of can overcome that, right? And I think that, again, I think this Pirkei Avot text is very much a text for the teachers themselves, right? In other words, it's something to help you deal with the reality of, right? These are the people, right? Just like it's like, these are the people that are going to be at your Seder. So then these are the people that you're going to have among your disciples. And you're going to have to be prepared for dealing with them, right? And again, I would say, like, is this a text of inclusion or exclusion, right? That it, and you're right, I think too, in pointing that it's like, there's no exclusion going on. It's just like, this is the one who's going to be here, right? And I would note too, that with the second text, right? You know, they're rasha, but there's nothing going on here that suggests that that they are excluded in some sort of permanent way, right? There's no corporal punishment, right? Yeah, Margot, yeah.
In the first one, everyone was in the room, and in this one, someone's not attending, which
Right.
is, so there's more of an exclusion, self-exclusion,
Right.
there that relates to what you were saying about the 4 questions.
Right.
Whereas the previous example doesn't quite have that quality.
Right.
I mean, maybe the person is excluding themselves, like, emotionally and intellectually, by getting angry quickly and not being appeased, but they are actually in the room.
Right. 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 Exactly. Yeah. No. And I also think in that text, I don't think there isn't a mode of blame. There isn't the language of like, well, they did it to themselves or anything. It's just that it's their character, right? And it's a challenge to deal with that kind of character, for sure. And the text doesn't say, well, this is how you deal with it, right? It just, though I do think that there is this kind of language, right, with the first two, where it says, well, their reward is negated by their gain, right? Or their loss it's not reward, right? It's their gain is negated by the loss, and the loss is negated by the gain, right? I think that what it may be that the text is insinuating that the one here, I'll go back to it, right? That the easy to provoke and hard to appease, the bad one, that they're hopeless in a way, right? In other words, they're just not going to get it. And that's struggling. You know, I struggle with that. I think we should struggle with that the way we struggle with the wicked child of the Seder too, right? In other words, should it be so simple, right? And again, I don't know what the answer is. Again, I say, is this a text of inclusion or exclusion? Because by even thinking about them, right, it provokes us to say, okay, well, what do we do about this, right? What responsibility does this create for us, the ones who are reading this text, right? It may be that the intention of this teaching originally was to say, hey, look, teacher, rabbi, listen, you can't reach everybody, and it's not your fault, right? So there's a mode of comfort here, right? Which may be the same thing as when the parent is supposed to say, look, this is what God did for me when I left Egypt, right? It's to say, look, you're staying faithful to the tradition. There's nothing you can do about the other person. Though you, in that case, obviously, you do try to do something, right? You rebuke them, you hit them, right? Here, there's no answer like that, right? Nothing is given, but maybe it's just to say, hey, you know, there's nothing you can do. But then I wonder, right? Well, but what if could we push ourselves to do more with the ones who are hard to provoke, right? Sorry, easy to provoke and hard to appease, et cetera. The students who are more challenging. Is there something more we could do about that? Have we really pushed the limits of inclusivity? Are we really sure that the one who's easy to provoke and hard to appease can't be put into a different category, perhaps? Right.
Bill?
Yeah.
What your comments you just made makes me think of what we could generally call the movement of inclusion in Jewish education for those who have learning differences and learning challenges. Because today, that's where we would look upon that and say, you know, we are trying to, they are easy to provoke and difficult to learn. And yet we try to figure out how to include them.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's very much on my mind when I look at these texts. And what strikes me is that by talking about them, I say them, right? I don't mean just difficult students or challenging students, right? But by talking about all students, right? We're weaving a narrative that is in a way inclusive, right? And so what I'm suggesting in a way is a way to read these texts in a way that actually puts on us this kind of responsibility to be truly inclusive and to push the boundaries between who is included and who is excluded, right? And what inclusion looks like and what exclusion looks like, right? I would say that with the case of learning challenges, right, it's a little bit different than what I would call the more moral religious framework, right? So it's true that like the text above, right, is about different kinds of students, right? And it is moralistic, right? Ra is bad, right? They're bad. Maybe it just means they're a bad student, but maybe we shouldn't even think that way, right? But I do think that I do think that with these more moralistic framings, right? I think we still believe in having moral standards in a community or religious standards in a community, right? Even when we might disagree about what those standards should be. So at some point there has to be this movement to say, look, this is what we value and this is a problem for us in the community. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with exclusion when we need to? And what are we doing when we do that? And what kind of violence is done, right? It doesn't have to be physical violence, right? But to exclude somebody, to put someone in a position of alienation, even for good reasons, is an act of violence also. And so I think what I want us to get out of these texts is, well, when do we really want to do that, right? In the case of children who may present learning differences, we probably don't want to be excluding them, right? We I think are sort of certain that we don't want to do that in our own time, right? We want to have a more capacious view, but that hasn't always been the case, right? I want to look at this one more text there are 4 types among those who sit before the sages, right? So this is another 4 types of students. One, a sponge, a funnel, a strainer, and a sieve, right? So these are metaphors, right, for various kinds of, using the metaphor of liquid, the technologies of liquid retention and transference, right? The sieve here and the funnel, I think, are related particularly to wine production, which of course was, central to ancient cultures, and they all knew how to make wine, even if they weren't directly involved in the production, right? So there are 4 types of students among those who sit before the sages: a sponge, a funnel, a strainer, a sieve, and a sieve, right? So the sponge soaks up everything. But no, this isn't necessarily a good thing, right? This is not the best type of student, right? Because they take in everything, but they may fail to distinguish between what's valuable and what's secondary, right? So a really strong, we're going to see this in a moment, right? A strong student is the student who is able to figure out what's really valuable, to distill what's the most valuable in learning, right? So a funnel takes in one end and lets it out at the other, right? That just everything goes through with them. In other words, this is in one ear, out the other. That's the funnel, right? The strainer lets out the wine and retains the lees, right? So the strainer, usually we think of a strainer as being a good thing, right? But with the metaphor here, though, is that the strainer retains the bad stuff, and this is really the most problematic, right? They remember, this is one who, well, this is maybe not the most problematic, right? Probably second, right? They retain something, but it's the stuff that's secondary or less important, right? And then a sieve, right, lets out the coarse meal and retains the choice flour, right? So the sieve here, this is a flour metaphor rather than a liquid, a solid rather than a liquid metaphor. So it's the sieve who's the really the strongest student, right? And here we have just some very basic psychological wisdom here about different types of students, right? Pedagogical psychological wisdom. You don't really have the moralistic framing. No one's good or evil. And there isn't a particular exclusionary moment in the text. And I think it's helpful in understanding something about the theme of 4 that I want to expand on in just a moment. But there is again this kind of realism, perhaps, of the different types of learners that you have. It may be that part of the goal of this text is to say, well, look, some people aren't gonna get much out of what you teach, and you just have to kind of accept that and deal with that, right? But maybe part of the goal here is to say, look, there are students who when they present what their sort of natural capacities are, some students are going to be stronger than others, but there is something that you can do about that, right? There is a way you have to be aware of these different tendencies and capacities in order to be more inclusive as a teacher. Any other comments or questions at this point? Just feel free to jump in. So the connection I want to draw with the Seder and the theme of 4, now that we've seen some of these texts, is that I think that the number 4 for the rabbis is this number that relates to inclusion, but it may not always look like inclusion in the way we want to think about it, and that's okay. But what I want to suggest is that the rabbis, at the very least, understand that leaders, teachers, and parents all need to be mindful of the different types of people that are part of the community or putatively part of the community, right? Because some may leave themselves out. But the idea is that by having them as part of the narrative, that they are part of the community, they are on our minds, right? And we are thinking about all of them, right? We don't just teach the wisest students. We teach all the students, right? We don't engage only the wisest children, or only the children that we like, right? Or the children who do the right thing all the time. We engage them, all of them. We engage all of the students, we engage all of the children. We engage every member of the community. So in a sense, I think at least these texts challenge us to think about inclusion and exclusion in a sort of less binary way, right? That here are the people that we include and here are the people that we exclude. That once we've said, here are the people that are either challenging to us as students or failing to uphold the norms of the community, we are still thinking about them in our economy of community, right? In the way that we think about what we have here together in the community. And again, I'm not saying that I always applaud exactly how the rabbis of the Talmud kind of deal with this tension between inclusion and exclusion, but I do think that the way that they prompt us to think about it is worth reflecting on, especially as we engage in the Seder ourselves, right? So I think that if you're interested more in sort of the details about how the Seder is organized, right, I can get into that. But basically the Seder, the real organizational structure of the Seder is the 4 cups of wine. And the 4 cups of wine really are the marking points of the Seder. And that was a deliberate decision. And there is a kind of later midrash that suggests that the 4 cups is related to something stated in the book of Exodus, but this is really an ex post facto midrashic explanation. So I'm really contending that when the rabbis developed the Seder probably after the destruction of the Second Temple, right? Some of the material certainly existed before, but the Seder as we know it with its basic structure was based around 4 cups of wine. And the reason I think that the 4 cups of wine mattered so much to the rabbis of the Talmud, is precisely because of what the number 4 represents. It represents, and I think it's also rooted in the idea of like the 4 directions, right? North, south, east, and west. And then this is actually the one place where you do see the number 4 come up prominently in the Torah, in the Bible, right? Is the idea of the 4 different directions. And that is the 4 different directions really represent the entirety of the earth, right? You know the phrase from the liturgy probably, but also we just talk about this way, right? We say that the 4 corners of the earth, right? Well, so we know that the geography doesn't quite work anymore. The topography and the way that our planet is structured, it's not really 4 corners, right? But the idea that there are 4 directions, right? I mean, if you say all 4 directions, right? Obviously there could be sort of infinite directions around 360 degrees. But the idea of all 4 directions means from every perspective. And I think that that's what these texts do, is that the rabbis are saying, look, as leaders, as teachers, as parents, we have to be prepared and ready to deal with every single possible perspective that comes to us. Even if it's a perspective that challenges our communal norms, even if it's a perspective that sees itself as wanting to exclude itself from the community.
Bill, why do you relate the 4 cups of wine to the 4 directions other than that there's 4?
That's just my own jump in interpretation. That the important thing about the 4 cups of wine is that the rabbis insist on them, right? It's not like, oh, if you get sleepy, have only 3, right? It's not, and also the 4 cups of wine are tied to, well, let me make this sort of small literary point or halachic point, that the 4 cups of wine are each blessings that you say, they're cups of wine that are tied to a blessing, right? So we're all used to Friday night Kiddush, right? Where we say, Borei Pri Hagafen, and then we say the blessing over the wine, and then we say this formula welcoming in Shabbat or the holiday, if that's the case. All of the 4 cups of wine are tied to specific parts of the liturgy in that exact way. It's just that we do Kiddush that way every Friday night, but it's not the Seder is this kind of different thing, right? So it's not just have 4 cups of wine. It's that the whole Seder itself is structured around these 4 cups of wine. So I'm starting with this point of saying, like, well, what does the number 4 mean for the rabbis, right? The 4 directions is just a hunch I have of like, why do they associate the number 4 with inclusivity? And I think when you look at these texts from Pirkei Avot chapter 5, right, they have this structure, right? It's like there are 2 qualities, and some go this way and this way, and some go this way and this way, and so, right? And it all fits together as kind of 4 directions. That's just my own hunch about how the number 4 works for them, why that number 4 means something for them. But it's at a much deeper culture. I'm suggesting that there's this kind of deep cultural resonance of the number 4, like a kind of literary cultural association with the number 4.
Or more than even cultural, just human.
Yeah, it may be.
It's so universal, you know, the 4 directions. So, you know, that's everyone, not just Jews.
Oh, yes. No, certainly. Yes. No, I do think that and then this actually gets to the next text that I want to look at, but that I think that the possibilities of this being universalistic and, you know, is certainly there, right? I think in the rabbinic understanding, the universalism comes through in the possibility and the hope for the Messiah, right? In the possibility of final redemption, right? And we experience that and by the way, right? When does redemption come up in the Seder, right? It most prominently, the theme of redemption comes up in the Seder, or final redemption, messianic redemption comes up with opening the door for Elijah. So what do we do when we open the door for Elijah? There's another thing that we do. We have a 5th cup of wine, right? So the idea is that the 4 cups of wine is kind of the 4 cups of wine is this world, right? This world, we have the earth, we're on the earth, and we have the 4 corners of the earth, and we have real people, some of whom are more models of learning and communal participation and ethical rectitude, right? And we have people who are not so much. They're our challenging students. They're the people who don't learn so well. They're the people who flout the communal norms and standards, who fail to be moral, right? Who fail to uphold the traditions, who fail to support community. That's the reality. So 4 cups of wine is reality. If you're talking about messianic redemption and everyone in the world gets along, you need a 5th cup of wine for that. That's outside of our normal reality.
But also that part of the Seder is where we deeply exclude.
Yeah, I'll say more. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, spell it out. Yeah.
Well, pour out your wrath. You know, that's we open the door, we seriously exclude in a way that's really uncomfortable for a lot of us.
Yep.
And then there's the 5th cup.
Right.
Or concurrent with that.
Right. And again, this is, I mean, I think that what I say to this is the same thing, you know, that in responding to Eileen before, that that there are parts of the Jewish liturgy that we think are kind of really don't represent the way we want to think about these issues. And so it may make sense for us to not say them precisely because they don't really speak to what they're doing. I mean, I think in some ways, if I want to leave you with anything, is that if there's something in the text that you want to leave out, if we leave it out with an understanding about what it was supposed to do, maybe we can replace it with something that really speaks to something deeper in the tradition, so that we replace it with a deeper understanding about what it is that in what way, right? In what way are we, like, I guess I would say, like, if we're gonna say that we're deeply uncomfortable with parts of our tradition, let's do it as the wise child and not the wicked child, right? Let's do it with knowledge and understanding, and not just saying, poof, I'm done with this, I don't need this anymore, right? Because that I think, you know, can create some sustainable tradition for us, right? And also that we may not want to recite these texts, but we should know about them too, right? We should understand what they were about. We should understand where they were coming from. And I actually want to say something about this related to, I want to connect, Margot, I'm really glad you raised this sort of the pour out your wrath against the nations, which we recite. It's a verse from Ezekiel, if I'm not mistaken, that we recite when we open the door for Elijah and pour that fifth cup, which, by the way, we don't drink, right? So you don't actually have to drink a fifth cup of wine, which is good to know. I think that I want to connect that passage, the pour out your wrath against the nations, to the violence against the wicked child from the four children. I want to be very careful in how I say this, because I don't want to make it seem like I'm defending the violence of these texts or the ethical problems of these texts. I don't really mean to do that. But what I do think is that they speak to a particular moment in the Jewish holiday cycle. And this is why I want to look at a text about Sukkot in a moment. But to set that up, I want to say what I think about Pesach, that I think Pesach is a time of great anxiety and a great tension between us and the nations, right? Pesach is the moment at which we are born as a nation from violence done to us by a nation that dominates us, that oppresses us and puts us into slavery. And so it's a moment of great trepidation. There's great fear. Are we going to be able to escape Egypt? Right? And then in the way we experience the Seder, we're supposed to be able to connect to that fear, to that anxiety with in a visceral sort of way. And we're supposed to confront the violence that we've experienced and that is being done by God, and in the traditional story, right? That the violence enacted by God on the Egyptians. And the Seder gives us room, I think, to be joyous over that retribution, and that creates a different kind of ethical problem too, right? I don't want to give a sort of give everybody the same answer as to how to deal with that, but what I would say is I do think that one of the things I want us to come away with is this sense that the Passover moment is a moment of fear and anxiety, a moment of trepidation, a moment where we're really worried who's leaving themselves in and who's joining us, right? And who's leaving themselves out, right? And to use this phrase, and again, I'm not defending it, but if this is the moment where people are tempted to say, you're either with us or against us, this is the moment kind of in the Jewish calendar where that temptation is the highest, right? We need you, right? This is, I think, the reason that the response to the wicked child is so harsh, right? Is because Passover in particular is this moment of like, hey, look, we really need you with us because we're going through something as a nation. We've been oppressed. We're looking to escape. We're looking to form ourselves as a nation, to become independent, to become free. And we're not sure of what the result's going to be. And we really need you here. But if we read this text kind of critically, then we can say, well, okay, yeah, this is a moment that we have, but do we risk succumbing to the temptation of violence against those who present the greatest difficulties for our community in a way that goes beyond what we really want, right? Are we actually, right? And I think this is what I was saying to Eileen before, right? Like the text kind of undoes itself, right? To the point where it's not acceptable to us anymore as a way of doing it. But I want to kind of honor what the challenge of that moment, that's a real thing for us as a community, that in moments of stress, in moments of difficulty, we look at people who aren't participating and we say, hey, look, we need you. This is a problem. We need you with us, right? And not that there are easy answers of how we deal with it, because there are all sorts of temptations to deal with these kinds of moments with violence. But at the same time, the challenge is a real one, right? It's a real challenge. But there are other moments in the Jewish calendar, right? And we go through the holiday cycle. We go from Pesach to Shavuot and then to Sukkot in the fall. And Sukkot is a time where that is really the Bible understands, the Bible and the later rabbinic tradition really understands Sukkot as the culmination of the great joy of redemption, right? All of the holidays, in a sense, are about the exodus from Egypt. And Sukkot represents the culmination of this. The Sukkot represent the wanderings of the people in the desert, but it means that they've been liberated, right? And it also represents the continuity of the divine presence in being liberated, right? I don't want to spend too much time talking about Sukkot. It's 6 months away, but there's also the Lulav and Etrog, which represents the joyousness of the moment, right? It's the joyousness of having the bounty of harvest, right? And all of the blessings that we experience in life. And it's a way of expressing gratitude for all of those blessings. So here we have a different kind of text, which is about 4, right? So there are 4 species in the Lulav, right? The Lulav is refers to the palm branch, but there's also the myrtle and the willow, and then the citron, the etrog, which all make up the whole thing that we call Lulav, right? So you have 4 different species of plants that we use to celebrate. So here in this text, this is a midrash about the Lulav that I think a lot of you are familiar with, right? Another explanation of the Lulav, right? The fruit of a beautiful tree. These are referring to Israel, meaning different types of people in the Jewish people. Just like this citron, which has taste and smell, so too Israel has among them people who have Torah and good deeds. Okay, so far, you have 2 categories. You have taste and you have smell. And the taste refers to, I forget which is which, but I think it's taste is Torah and smell is good deeds. I actually think I developed this teaching once where, the reason taste is Torah and smell is good deeds is because like the taste is kind of the core thing. It's like in the fruit itself, whereas the smell is kind of what it gives off into the world, right? So the good deeds, like the Torah, you learn Torah and you internalize it. It's part of you. And the good deeds are the things that kind of go out into the world. So that's why the smell is associated with good deeds. So the citron, the etrog, has both taste and smell, right? And the branches of a date palm, right? The date has taste but no smell, right? So that they have Torah but no good deeds, right? So that means like a date palm, right? The actual date is very tasty, but the date palm smells terrible, right? The actual branch, right? A branch of a braided tree. This is the hadass, the myrtle. They're referring to, these are also referring to Israel. The myrtle has smell and no taste, right? It smells nice, but no good fruit comes of it. Israel has among them people of good deeds and don't have Torah, right? And then the willow of the brook, the arava. These willows have no smell and no taste, so there are people who have no Torah and no good deeds, right? So here again, we have this kind of categorization, right? There are the best, most pious Jews who have Torah and good deeds. And there's some who have good deeds, but they're not really learned. There's some who are learned, but they fail to practice their learning as they should. And there are those who don't have either, right? This is the point I want to make. And I think that when we read this text with keeping in mind that Sukkot is a holiday that has a more positive messianic association, right? The idea of the fulfillment. And by the way, Margot, to your point about the cup of Elijah, right? The visions of Sukkot in the book of Zechariah. So if you look at, if you wait 6 months, or if you don't want to wait 6 months, you can look at the Haftarah for Sukkot from the book of Zechariah. And it's a much more universalistic. I mean, not to say there isn't punishment, but the idea is that all of the nations are participating in the final messianic redemption. In Jerusalem, granted, it's still sort of Judeo-centric in a way, right? But it's a universalistic image of redemption. That you don't see that in Pesach, right? It's not all of the nations. It's us against the nations. That's the Pesach moment, right? It's a very us against them type of moment, right? But that's why we also have Sukkot, right? Because then Sukkot gives us that possibility of all of the nations united and also all of the people united. And so what we have here at the end is, right, what does the Holy One of Blessing do to them, meaning the 4 species, right? To destroy them is impossible. And this is very important, I think, in relating to our text, right? To destroy them is impossible, but rather the Holy One of Blessing said, bind them all together, into one grouping, and these will atone for those. And if you have done that, I will be elevated at that time. And this is the meaning of the verse in Amos, in the prophet Amos, the one who built the upper chambers in heaven. And when is God, including God's elevation? I forgot to take out the his there. When is God elevated? When they make one grouping, as it is stated, and establish God's grouping on earth. Hence Moshe warned Israel, and you shall take for yourselves on the first day. Okay, we don't have to worry about all of the textual gymnastics going on at the end there, but the main point is that the way that the rabbis envision the 4 species of the Lulav is a unification of the Jewish people. All 4 are united. So while the Pesach text is more of a text that emphasizes the need or the possibility of exclusion, the Lulav text is very much more an inclusionary text, right? To destroy them is impossible. Let us bind them together, and there will be, and granted, there's still, the good ones are still doing the work for the not good ones, right? But there's the possibility of everyone being bound together in tshuva, that everyone is bound together in return. Tshuva, we translate as repentance, but more in the sense of everyone returns to God together. And it's by that inclusivity of all of the people, in the community, the ones who uphold the norms of the community and the values of the community, and the ones who fail to do so. It's by including everyone together that we build a real community, that we elevate the divine within the world, right? And that's, I think that to me, this Lulav text then becomes very important in understanding this number 4, right? That there are different possibilities within this number 4, right? So sometimes a text of 4 can be more exclusionary, more inclusive. Sometimes it can be more judgmental, less judgmental. And we may respond to those texts in different ways. But I think what's important to appreciate, and Eileen, this is kind of my like belated response to, saying, I don't want this text, right? Like, I get it, and I it's not to challenge that decision, right? But more to say, let's appreciate what's happening at Pesach. Like, what is Pesach about, right? And to appreciate that it is more of an us against them type of holiday, and that's not the extent of Judaism. That there's a different moment that we have, and to appreciate these as different spiritual moments. And maybe when we get to Shavuot, I'll teach about Shavuot being kind of on the way in between, right? How revelation is in between those moments where we kind of elevate ourselves to accept. I mean, what is Shavuot? It's our receiving norms and standards, accepting values that we relate to God, to live by them, to really affirm them, right? And to take us on the way from a more exclusionary approach to a more inclusive approach, which is ultimately where we want to be. We have 10 minutes on our schedule, so I'd love to entertain any kind of questions or comments. It's wonderful being with you all.
Pesach will never be the same for me again.
Good.
Thank you, Bill. Bill, thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate it.
I took a lot of notes and I will review them.
Okay, great.
I don't know which category I go in now.
Oh, well, that's it. There's a lot of great there's a lot of great Torah, a lot of great interpretation on the 4 children. I'm going to stop the sharing now, but there's a lot of great, the most important one, I think, is like we're not one or the other. We can be all 4, at different times, at different ways. And, all of these elements come together, within us, right? Sometimes there are different stages of life, or different moments in our own sort of spiritual growth and development.
I would just comment on a family note that 3 of us understand that when Kenny and I were children and Mom and Dad had the Seder, Mom was the religious one. Dad, I don't think had ever been to a Seder in his life, but we humored him and we brought Dad along while we were learning. Dad was learning too. And Dad also provided an incredible happiness to us when he would come up with some very pithy comments, which to this day still stay with us, that we recite at the Passover Seder. So we're greatly indebted to two different people, mom and dad, probably on opposite ends of the spectrum, and we think it turned out pretty well. But by virtue of you, Bill, you're part of that.
Yeah, well, look,
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a great example of why you need everybody there, right? In other words, like the
Absolutely.
Rasha, like
We were not going to exclude that.
yeah, I'm not sure that being goofy and making jokes though is always Rashab, right? It's like it's not quite fit into either of those categories, right? But it's But Chacham, by the way, the word we translate as wise can also mean clever. So it may just be a different type of, right?
That could have been it. That could have been it. That could explain it.
That's it's not all one or the other, right? It can be multiple things at the same time. So
Yeah,
you can
yes.
appreciate people from different perspectives. Great being with you all. Have a wonderful, joyous
Thanks so much.
Stay
Thank
safe
you.
and healthy.
Yeah,
Great
okay.
being with
Chag
you.
Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Take care.
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Bill.
Great to see you, Eileen. Take care.
Thanks, Bill.
Margot, great to see you. Gladys.
It's great.
Thank you.
Everybody, great to see you all. Thank you. Great to
Thank
see
you.
you. Wonderful.
Bye. Take care.